We believed from the beginning that this case was not what it appeared to be, and we are absolutely convinced that while today is a first giant step in the right direction, the next step will lead to a complete dismissal of the charges.
That was attorney Benjamin Brafman speaking about the sexual assault case against his client, the former IMF chief, Dominique Strauss-Kahn. A judge today is going to decide whether or not to drop all criminal charges against Dominique Strauss-Kahn. And of course, prosecutors are saying that the accuser repeatedly lied to investigators and it has hurt the case. For more on the recent developments, we are joined right now by lawyer Doug Burns. He's a former federal prosecutor. He has his own private practice now. Doug, welcome back to the Inside Track.
Thanks.
What do you make? We just played that soundbite from Brafman.
Sure.
If you gave him a grade, what would it be?
Well, it would be an A with a qualification. First of all, Ben is a terrific lawyer. He's been in a lot of big cases over the years. The only qualification, taking nothing away from him, is the fact that they were able to bring to bear a lot of resources, okay? In other words, investigators were able to go out and uncover a lot of what was going on. Although, in fairness, it was the DA who stepped forward and said, we have found out that she has these credibility issues, but I give him an A, yeah.
Which leads us to Cyrus Vance,
Sure.
the DA. This is a huge black mark now on his record, is it not?
It was so interesting because he was caught in a box, as I had said earlier, and the box was, look, you have somebody from France, so if we don't act quickly and he goes back to France, then I'm going to look bad. But the reverse ended up being worse, which is coming on too strong and then having to backpedal. But you know what? I'll defend Cyrus Vance. I mean, look, that's why we have this distinction between probable cause and beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, you have probable cause to believe that he did the crime, so you act quickly. That's in the interest of the citizens. Then you investigate and you find out that there are problems. The criticism is, you know, you should have investigated first, but you know what? You have to bring an indictment quickly, right?
Okay,
exactly.
So you would say, fair to say, Cyrus Vance, at this point, cutting his losses, moving on. Do you expect the case to be dropped 100%?
Oh, yeah. I mean, basically, it's a formality. The judge has no reason to turn around and say, you know, I'm not going to dismiss it. So, you know, this is a dismissal on recommendation. It's sort of pro forma. So to the extent that people are saying the judge is going to decide this later at 11:30, I mean, he's, you know, I'm not going to use a pejorative term like rubber stamp, but he's going to grant the motion.
Out of curiosity, the hotel maid who was the accuser still has the right to bring a civil case against Dominique Strauss-Kahn. What do you think is the likelihood there, given the fact that the criminal case seems like it's going to be dismissed?
Well, you know, there are certain requirements where you have to file notice, and she already did that, so she already initiated it. It was interesting, Deirdre, because some people had pointed out, and they were right, that prosecutors could be upset about that, because then on cross-examination, it's like, isn't it true that you've already filed a civil suit seeking money, thereby further impugning her motivation and integrity? But she did already file that. It will be very interesting to see what happens with it. It's hard to predict.
I was just going to say, can you give us a guess?
I don't have a crystal ball, but I wouldn't be surprised if it were settled for some type of amount, because I don't think I think Dominique Strauss-Kahn obviously wants to just completely put this behind him.
So it would be worth it to him to spend a little money to make it all go away?
Possibly. It's hard to say. Because don't forget, with all this baggage and credibility problems, you know, you can cross-examine her the same way you would have in the criminal case. So it's hard to predict. Look, back to your original question, though, the defense did a terrific job. But on many levels, Dominique Strauss-Kahn's a very lucky man, because change the law school hypothetical. Let's assume that the maid was a graduate student at Columbia. Okay, seriously, think about that for a second, who had impeccable credibility. That'd be a whole different situation.
It would be a whole different situation.
Doug, there are many criticisms being leveled at Cy Vance and his prosecutors in this case. In your opinion, based on what you've read, and you read the submission to the judge last night, are they doing the right thing?
I think they are. I mean, it's interesting. The public has to understand the distinction between proving a case in court versus whether the person did it. In other words, a lot of people say in a frustrated fashion, what do you mean they're dropping it? I think he did the crime. But if you can't prove it, then you're legally not guilty. That doesn't mean factually you didn't do it. Doesn't mean morally you're not responsible. Interesting point, which is kind of fascinating. You look at it from 30,000 feet, use the old airplane metaphor. Two people on this planet know exactly what happened in that room, okay? Dominique Strauss-Kahn and then the complainant. But we don't have a vehicle for, you know, taking a photograph of their brain and figuring out ourselves exactly what happened.
But as we pointed out this morning, a civil court may end up
Yes,
ruling
absolutely.
on this issue.
That's right. And in the civil case, you may be able to bridge that distinction between, okay, she has baggage and credibility problems, but here's what happened. There were 2 points, by the way, in the favor of the prosecution that emerged from the submission. You guys might find this interesting. Number one, that it was a relatively brief encounter, which is more consistent with a forcible thing. And number two, what's called outcry evidence. Very often you cross-examine a victim and you say, well, you sat on this information for 6 months. Apparently, she did contemporaneously report. So those were the 2 pro-prosecution points. But again, the credibility baggage was so bad that they just feel they can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt.
Getting back to the accuser's attorney, Kenneth Thompson,
Yes.
he took an unusual step
He
as
did.
well by going public, right? He just went right out there.
That's a great point, and I'll tell you why. He did a number of things. Number one, he criticized the DA, but Cy Vance is not the type of guy who's going to factor that in necessarily, but he said he's a coward. He's afraid to try the case. I mean, that's pretty harsh. 2, the woman was interviewed twice by the national media. No prosecutor wants to see their victim do that because you're creating fodder for cross-examination. So the victim representation created some problems, but that's not why
Was he
Cy
setting
Vance...
that up for the civil case?
Possibly. Good point. But, you know, it's interesting. At the end of the day, their submission said that, you know, sex took place, but on the question of was it forcible versus consensual, she's the only game in town. She's our only witness. There's no eyewitnesses, and we just can't prove it. What's interesting, and I was talking to some experts about this last night, is could you make the argument, well, wait a minute, they're saying they can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Isn't that up to a jury to determine? The answer is no, because under ABA standards, New York State ethical standards, a prosecutor really shouldn't pursue a case unless he or she thinks they can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt.
Doug, we're so glad to have your insight. Thanks so much. Doug Burns, a former federal prosecutor. He now has his own practice.